Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll try to live up to that round of applause by try not to make planning too boring over the next 2 hours. It's a shortened version. So this has been entitled the Development Strategy Toolkit because this is kind of an accumulation, like an abbreviated accumulation of my experience and my knowledge working with clients, developers, investors over the years, about 20 years in planning, property, so on and so forth, both as a lawyer and as a planning barrister, a planner and a chartered surveyor. So it's regarded as a bit of a toolkit because we kind of reach into whichever tool in the toolkit you need at that point in time, depending upon which officer you're dealing with, what kind of scheme you're dealing with as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But in terms of my experience, just to give you a quick flavour in terms of where it's all come from, it is a bit of a mixture. Started off as a chartered surveyor, was in valuation, was in agency for a while, and then went into planning consultancy, which has actually been a really good experience because in the last few years, I've actually begun to get more involved directly in development, and I actually work on a few development projects as a development partner in some cases as well. So having that valuation and agency background gives us a real life context for the planning. It's not planning for its own sake, it's that kind of just to add value as well. So we've worked as a practice, and I've worked with a number of pretty big substantial clients over the years as well. CPC Group, that was the Candy Brothers. I was involved in the High Court litigation against Qatari DR, acting for CPC Group after Candy Brothers exited from that, which was pretty interesting, finding out what Prince Charles was going to say the following morning in the Evening Standard. So it was a bit of a surprise. So as an overview in terms of where this is going for the next 15 minutes or so, the idea is to steer you through our overall approach to these sorts of projects. And we start with trying to manage the risk and the planning risk and trying to give clients a sense of certainty to whatever degree you can do in the planning system. So you're using law, you're going through PD, prior approval, you're trying to create fallback positions, and then out of there you're trying to use policy creatively, and then there's a few practical tips and strategies. I'm not going to go into detail on planning committees and planning appeals tonight, but it's going to be mostly focused on law. I know it's a great disappointment to all of you, and you're really looking forward to that. So in terms of the background, in terms of... Cheers, mate. Thank you very much. I'll pay you later. In terms of lawful use and enforcement time limits, this is really, really important because we've got some really great results for our clients before on these. So, for instance, with a change of use to residential, you've had clients who have bought buildings. They may have been up to 20,000 square foot. They may have been a 2,500 square foot house in Golders Green or something like that. And there have been a lot of unlawful units in there, which, without the planning, effectively it's valueless. Then we go in, we sort out certificate of lawfulness, we use our savvy in law and in terms of drafting and knowing the evidence and knowing the way that things are looked at by the lawyers in the council, because I used to be a senior and principal planning lawyer at several councils, and then trying to get great results for our clients like this one here. So this is a very extreme example, but you'll see actually there's a very large house here. It stretches actually all the way across. It was a former Jesuit mission hostel, Class C2 use in Camden. You'd have struggled to get planning permission for that to residential Class C3 use because it's regarded as a protected social and community use in their policy. Client moved in, he sprawled himself and his family and his workmen all over the place, and he left it like that and lived like that for the next 4 years. Council didn't know a thing about it, and then 4 years later we got about 8 to 10 affidavits together, council's opinion, put them into the council, and hey presto, we get a certificate of lawful use. And because there's no affordable housing requirement on a certificate of lawful use, we just saved him £5 million in affordable housing payments to change the use, plus a £1 million seal payment. So that's not a bad return. All in 8 weeks. Thank you. One of the things that we one of the other things that we look for is also due diligencing problems as they come up. So, for instance, this is one of the things that does come up, it's little known, it's called the intervening planning breach, and that's where, in this case, for instance, there was a corner property, it was two flats, ground floor and first floor, and there was a change of use, which was unlawful. Now, the flats themselves could have been just converted straight away to HMOs in this case, and if that would have been done properly with shared accommodation, they would have been lawful, it would have been perfectly all right. But unfortunately, because the architect or the builder was speaking to the housing department and not the planning department, they spoke to the wrong officers, they got the wrong advice. The housing officers said, and they looked at it only in environmental health and housing terms and said, it looks okay to us. But of course, all the rooms were completely self-contained, which is a completely different use class. And that meant that they were all unlawful and in breach of planning control. And once that happens, it's the intervening planning breach. You lose the PD rights that you would have had to go to HMO for each of those flats. It meant probably about £50,000 worth of strip-out works to the client. So, you know, if that was a situation where we're approached by a client who's interested in buying a building like that in that use, we're savvy enough to know that that's a cost that we don't want to burden our investors or our clients with as well. Prior approval, this is a well-worn path, of course, for many of you. You've already been through this, particularly with Office to Resi. But we know a few tricks of the trade as well in terms of getting through prior approval. We're looking at one or two sites which some people are walking away from because there's a bit too much flood risk in there. We've managed to get PD on sites for flood risks or flood zones of 2 and 3. So if you know how to do it, and you're quite savvy, and you know how to use the Environment Agency to remodel the site as well, you can go in and you can pick up the land a lot cheaper than it might have been available otherwise. If you know how to use transport and parking assessments as well. So what we do is this site only had enough car parking for about 50 units according to the council's policy. We got PD for 105 units on here because we instructed a transport assessment consultant. We framed the instructions in such a way as we directed them to try and save as many of the car parking spaces as possible by using much smaller units. And that helped us to push the number of units up. In fact, so much so that the parking officer was actually against the scheme, didn't offer any evidence. We went to appeal after the council had refused it on his recommendation. And because he didn't offer any evidence, we got the council for a full award of costs as well. Sometimes prior approval isn't prior approval. This is particularly a quirk down in the southeast where you're looking at habitats and upland. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. It's a very complicated area of law, but again, it's an example of the kinds of stuff that we look at. This is a site which is in Farnborough, in the borough of Rushmore. Planning application has just been submitted in the last 24 hours for 113 units. So we've been guiding the strategy and putting the planning application all on this. We've managed to negotiate the affordable housing down to zero on this with the help of economic viability consultants. The difficulty here was, in principle, is that because it's close to natural heathland and upland, that it's subject to EU Habitats Directive, which means that you can get PD on it, but because of the parallel system relating to the EU Habitats Directive, you can't implement or occupy it unless you have what's called a site for alternative natural green space, which is basically like parkland, where people can take their dogs for a walk and go running and all that sort of stuff instead. So you'll end up with a PD certificate, but it's of absolutely no practical use for you. So in effect, you have to go through the planning system for that. But the great thing with sites like that is that the councils are primarily motivated towards getting the money in for the SANG, the Site of Alternative Natural Green Space. So because that's an easy gain in terms of top priorities for you, then strategically that can help in the way that you talk to the officers. We're also looking very carefully at things like PD opportunities where there's planning conditions on them to stop the change of use away from a B1. In fact, we're looking at one site in particular at the moment, which is in Buckinghamshire. It was turned down for about 90 units. We're talking with one or two people in the room at the moment about being able to fund this as an opportunity. So roughly £7.5 million purchase, but it makes a profit of about £7.5 million with the PD. The current vendors have walked away from it because of the B1 condition on it. Don't know why they did, because I picked up the phone to the planning officers and led them through a conversation, found another opportunity, something similar that had happened in the same area. And because of the conversation I was able to direct with the officers, it's led to us basically getting an email from the team leader confirming that if we submitted an application to remove that condition, they would probably grant that application, which would then clear the path for a resubmission of the previous prior approval application, which was turned down solely on that reason. So things like that, they're just small changes, but they can unlock massive value if you know how. So let's say you've worked through as much of the PD and the fallback as you possibly can. So what can you do now? So you can often use it as part of your negotiations with officers. If the scheme is large enough, then there's opportunities you can work out here. So we got PD for 42 units for a client here. We actually found and sourced this opportunity for them. It was about £6.5 million purchase. It's about £20 million GDV. It's in Hyams Park, which is in sort of near the Chingford area. It's a bit of an ugly mug of a building. And on the other side, there's a 4-storey new build as well. But the magic is that it backs on to an overground station, and it's also a town centre location. So we initially went forward to the council with a scheme saying, OK, you can we'll have the 42 units on the bottom, but we want more units on top as well. So it'll end up looking reclad, something like that on the right-hand side with about 60, 65 units. I have to say it's the first time in my 20 years of practice and the client's 30 years in the property industry, we've walked out of a meeting with officers when they said it's not enough development on site. And we were a little bit shocked at that, but in a good way, of course, partly because of the public transport availability I just referred to. So we're now looking at a comprehensive development as a whole scheme to try and take it up to 90 to 100 units. We're really pushing it. The good thing is, actually, I was involved in a bid process around the corner in relation to an old Art Deco cinema, and they recently got planning permission for 2 stories above what their own policies would normally favour in that area. So we're using that as an example as well. But one of the other reasons I mention this is it's a really good example of it depends which officers you're speaking to. Now, if you're speaking to the right officers you want to get in front of as soon as possible, particularly on these big schemes, are the policy and regeneration officers. And it's also quite a cute way of trying to due diligence on sites before we've got a few where we're working with clients who are looking at buying sites, and I speak to the policy and regeneration officers first, because they will know the direction in which policy is going in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Whereas the development control officers, A, they want the money for a pre-app, so they'll tell you pretty much bugger all in any event. And B, they will only tell you what policy says at the moment, or as far as the written policy is. But I've got staff out of regeneration officers who have a vision, who are policy officers who have a vision. And if the site is big enough and you can sell them on that vision, which is why it's really good to use CGIs, as I'm sure many of you do, you can imbue them with that vision. And it's a really good place to come from in having those conversations with officers. Couple of the other opportunities that we worked on. This one's actually recently just been built. They're selling off now. It's Heronsley. They actually initially looked at this site. This is in Harrow Weald, and they turned it down. A friend of mine bought me the site, and he said, "Can we do anything on this?" I was convinced that they'd made a wrong decision in turning it down. And had a meeting with the MD and their land buyer and managed to convince them that actually it's worth going ahead with. One of the reasons they turned it down was because it was a heavily encumbered site in planning terms, and they couldn't see any way in which it would be possibly developed. It's in the Green Belt. It's got a Grade 2 listed building on, 2 locally listed buildings, and it's covered with TPOs. Apart from that, there was nothing wrong with it. So this is the Grade 2 listed building, and then where the mansion is, it actually is on the left-hand side, and so it's all completely covered with ivy and falling down in any event. But we pitched it to them as a heritage restoration project. So again, it's all about vision. It's all about scoping them out. And because we were pitching it to them on that basis, one of the reasons why a lot of developers had turned this site down in the first place and turned their noses up at it was because they got too buried into the detail on things like abandonment, legal abandonment, which is a heavy legal issue. And quite frankly, they couldn't see the wood for the trees. Mind the pun. But what happened was you've got to stand back from some of these situations, and you've got to see the opportunity for what it really is. Clearly, they've locally listed the building, whereas English Heritage turned it down as a Grade 2 listed building. Now, why would they do that with a derelict structure unless they really want to see it preserved and see something happen there? Use your common sense. So go in there, have a constructive dialogue there. It's in everybody's interest to cut through all the nonsense with abandonment. Let's skip over that. And you know what? That was a 2-minute conversation with Head of Development Control. No, we don't need to talk about abandonment. We don't think that applies here. We'd like to see something happen on this site. And once we are past that, you're into a can-do attitude in terms of the site. So there are a few challenges that we're all going to have to face together in terms of what's coming forward in terms of the new National Planning Policy Framework, which of course guides most of development throughout the country. And one of those challenges is what's going to happen with affordable housing. Now, this is a very complex area with new case law coming forward, but in summary, what the government is trying to do is it's trying to move it towards a less negotiable area, an area covered by more certainty, less flexibility, perhaps moving more towards a tariff-based system. The whole language is changing as well in a way that actually, for many of you, you might feel it's a little bit on the anti-developer side, whereas the current National Planning Policy Framework talks about a shift towards competitive returns to developers. It's now talking about minimum returns to developers. However, there are opportunities within this in which you can always look to negotiate. And in my experience, having been a planning lawyer on the inside, there are opportunities with housing officers. What happens is, for instance, the DVS, the District Valuer Service, may look at your scheme and may say, well, it has to be 30%, 35%, 40%. It's very difficult to negotiate on the percentages, but then within that, you can negotiate on the tenures. And that tends to be taken more out of the hands of the DVS. If the DVS won't play ball on the percentages, the headline percentages, you can possibly speak to housing officers. And in my experience, as a lawyer on the other side, it has been possible to have this conversation with them, and they can look more flexibly in order to make the scheme work and make it stack up and make it viable. So then you perhaps look at maybe help to buy or shared ownership on some of the opportunities. One also has to be careful in terms of if you're in a situation where you can prove that there's no viability for affordable housing or a reduced amount of affordable housing to what you would normally have to provide, there's a very, very strong political pull on officers, and they'll be looking for a bit of cream on top, perhaps a second bite provision through a Section 106 later on. So perhaps after maybe 70 to 80% of the units have sold, there will be a need for a re-evaluation. So, but there are opportunities, there are silver linings to the cloud of the NPPF, and it's largely pushing in a way of moving away from minimum density standards, moving towards minimum density standards, talking about higher densities in town centres. There's a much stronger emphasis on using brownfield land, perhaps development between buildings where there's uneven building heights. There may be permitted development rights coming forward on that as well. Generally, a greater flexibility in relation to sunlight and daylight and other constraints relating to that. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the not so good news about affordable housing, but on the other hand, you've got the opportunities to try and push up your GDVs, to try and push up your returns by finding opportunities for development on the most appropriate sites. But overall, it is a very difficult system, and it's always changing. It's trying to It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall a lot of the time, and it requires a lot of persistence, patience, and a lot of pre-app sometimes as well. And it's a continuous exercise in readjusting your expectations as well. But it can be rewarding. This is one of the most rewarding schemes that we were involved in. This was Vivian Westwood Limited's HQ in Wandsworth. Went through a very lengthy planning performance agreement and pre-app process with Wandsworth, but ended up with a development that we could all be proud of. Vivian Westwood's firm certainly were. We had good relationships with officers throughout and with the GLA, and we ended up with a really good development. So yeah, it can be worth it, and hopefully will be worth it in the end. But that's just an overview of kind of how we tend to approach things with our clients, with our investors, on our own developments as well, managing that risk, finding those opportunities which other people sometimes cannot find or cannot see. And I just hope that's been very, very useful to you. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.